I also welcome my colleagues from the GRFDT, which is the Global Research Forum on Diasporas and Transnationalism. Both CISAN and GRFDT are doing intensive research on migration. And this is why we planned this event which is like an open discussion with the people who are in close relation, and of course they wrote these chapters for the IOM report. Our event today is on global migration governance and human rights. And this initiative is also part of a research project that we have here at the UNAM in Mexico with the GRFDT, which is called Communication and Diaspora Diplomacy. And we want to see in this project which are the relations between various types of actors, non-governmental actors, NGOs, the academia, think tanks such as the GRFDT. So it is a pleasure to welcome you all here. We will have 3 speakers. What they have in common is that they all come from an African perspective, which we don't have so often in Mexico. But also they wrote some chapters in the 2024 IOM report. And I'm gonna read their bios just before starting, and we will start with OTTILIA. And we have OTTILIA Ana MAUNGANIDZE. She's the head of special projects in the office of the executive director at the Institute for Security Studies. An international law and human rights advocate, she promotes human security in Africa by advancing peace and justice. OTTILIA explores new areas of work for the ISSS and informs international strategy. Her areas of interest include accountability, emerging security threats, international criminal justice, international human rights law, and migration trends and policy. OTTILIA previously conducted research on the legal and socio-political situations in countries in the SADC region, focusing primarily on the Indian Ocean Islands. Before joining the ISSS in 2009, she worked as a junior legal advisor in Grahamstown, now Makanda, and as a human rights education coordinator for the Eastern Cape chapter of Amnesty International. OTTILIA has a Master of Laws in Fundamental Rights Litigation and International Human Rights Law, a PJC, a PDIS, and an NLB in Sociology. Among other board and community positions, she serves on the 2023-2024 WEF Global Future Council on the Future of Good Governance. OTTILIA, the floor is yours. OTTILIA will be our first speaker, and then we will follow up with Amanda and PADDY. I'm seeing they already joined, and I'm happy to welcome you all. Please take notes, and we will follow up with a discussion on any of the topics that you're interested in. Please go ahead.
Maybe let me switch on my video, Camelia. Thank you very much, Camelia. Thank you to all the colleagues that are connected for this conversation. As Camelia mentioned, I contributed to the chapter in the IOM migration report focusing on this question around human security. But really, and I think before I go into some of that detail from an African perspective, I do think it's important for us to almost take a step back and reflect on why we are having some of the kinds of conversations we are having now about migration. And really we see that migration is very much and increasingly so quite a politicized topic and theme. Often, this politicization, which has with it also connected approaches that center security over governance and over human rights, are informed by myths around migrants, around migration itself, but also, depending on the context, very much around some of the ongoing populist global discourse. For us, from the African perspective, you find at the AU level, this is the African Union, pushes to have migration seen and understood as a development issue where it is good, well managed effectively. Migration allows for Africa to be able to unlock its development potential. This is across different reasons because, of course, people do migrate for economic reasons, but also because people are able through remittances, not only financial, but social, cultural, and other remittances, to be able to remain connected with their home countries. For the majority of African migrants, an estimated 80%, their countries of choice are often countries within their neighborhood. So while there are about 20% of Africans that leave the African continent, the majority remain within the continent. This is both those that move voluntarily and those that are forcibly displaced. In looking at human security and how it connects with migration, we sought to look at the full migration cycle because often the discussions around migration center only on host communities and the narratives around migrants and migration and host communities. And this, in many ways, can also be to the detriment of the necessary human rights protections for migrants at their countries of departure and also in transit. To use an example, since 2014, a lot of the discourse around migration, African migration in particular, has focused on those people who cross the Mediterranean into Europe from the African continent, often taking very precarious routes. Far less attention is taken on those people that are crossing within the African continent, similarly taking risks, but often also within environments that enable that movement, whether it is in West Africa, where we see efforts towards greater regional integration through free movement of people and goods, or increasingly also in the East African region. But because the conversations center around the minority of migrants being those that follow irregular pathways, the response has been to basically limit options for access by securitizing migration. About 5 years ago, as the ISS, we conducted research exploring some of the migrant routes that African migrants out of West and Central Africa take. And we also looked at what economic opportunities lie on the migration route. What was interesting for us using the case of Niger was where people had no livelihood options at home, the migration journey itself presented some socioeconomic benefit. It meant that along the route, for those people that were traveling via countries like Niger northwards, that you had businesses supplying services to migrants, from transportation to accommodation to the sale of life jackets. Once there was an externalization policy on the part of the EU that resulted in more stringent border measures, this actually had a negative impact on socioeconomic activity in country. The result was that people who previously had chosen to stay within their countries now had limited economic opportunities and therefore sought to move. So when we look at the migration cycle, and I'll repeat this point, we are looking both from point of departure, points of transit, or even sometimes during transit, people will stay for some time, and then also at destination. And it is across these levels that we see governments employing different mechanisms, some of which to protect the fundamental rights of migrants, but some of which actually impact those fundamental rights. I've mentioned already the securitization approach, but also increased barriers of entry for migrants have meant, unfortunately, that migrants have taken more precarious journeys for those that are seeking to leave the continent, but also within. So we have seen new routes opening up in which these protections do not exist. Particularly moving some communities now moving from the West African coast of Africa towards South and Central America, which, as you can imagine, just by looking at the world map, is by no measure a simple and easy journey to take if you're not flying over and you're relying on sea transport, which isn't necessarily secure. So as I start to end, Camelia, on some of the points of reflection that we've had around what needs to be improved, we recognize that regular migration or regular pathways are the preferred pathway for the majority of people moving, particularly for the majority of Africans moving. But if the access points for regular pathways are limited, then people will choose irregular channels. Here, the efforts between individual countries, both on their own, but also in collaboration with neighboring countries and those further afield, need to focus more on enhancing regular pathways while managing some of the impacts of irregular migration. That means there is a great opportunity for more data and information sharing that allows for greater documentation of those people that are on the move. It also does require a recognition that there are migrants among those moving that are at greater risk of human rights abuses. In Southern Africa and West Africa, we have seen that women are more susceptible to abuses at points of crossing, at ports of exit and entry, and that there has to be measures in place that particularly target the specific experience of women without neglecting men and boys, but also recognizing some of the very specific dynamics that we're observing at border points. The third is the push towards a continental framework that enables greater movement through regular pathways. This will mean that less people opt for irregular pathways, and so the risk to their human rights are reduced. There has been 2 instruments that were adopted by the AU with this in mind. The first is an instrument, a protocol, an agreement rather, on the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is for goods and services. And then a protocol on free movement of people. The agreement on the African Continental Free Trade Area is almost universally ratified, while that on free movement is lacking the necessary ratifications. A few weeks ago at the African Economic Community, the ISS, together with UNDP, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, as well as the African Development Bank, pushed a message that in order for you to be able to unlock Africa's development potential, but also to be able to protect even those people on the move, you have to match the ratifications for free movement of people with that of goods. Because it doesn't help to center the economy around goods as if the services and the goods are not transported by individuals who, as we know, at least on the African continent, the majority of trade is informal cross-border trade, with over 70% of that informal cross-border trade being carried out by women. The final point, and then I end, Camelia, is how we need to be pushing more to enhance better narratives around migration. these shouldn't only center on the drivers of migration, the pull and push factors, but also they need to explore the benefit. PADDY, Amanda and I have often commented on how things like food and music and culture really unite people in ways that we don't often explore enough. But when we talk about migration, these are some of the issues that are sidelined. The focus is whether this migrant will be economically beneficial. Even the arrangements between Europe and Africa are focusing on Africans rather, simply as providers of labor, without recognizing that through movement, there are many aspects around development, around integration and inclusion that migrants also bring. So mine is a word of caution that yes, let's have really positive conversations about migration, but in doing so, let's ensure that we don't fall into the traps of populist rhetoric that reduces people on the move to workers and laborers. This is the kind of language, of course, that predates our existence, but that informed a lot of past abuses of people on the move, whether it was through the transatlantic slave trade or other mechanisms. So it is our responsibility as migration practitioners and human rights practitioners to be pushing positive messages that center migrants and that don't demonize migrants while still addressing the challenges of irregular migration. Thank you, Camelia.
Thank you so much, OTTILIA. We've learned a lot from your from your talk, and I think maybe we should add science to what unites people, because it's also a universal language. And yes, of course, there are two ways of seeing how we can talk about migrants. One perspective is that we should outline what they contribute to the countries of destination also. And the other maybe contrary perspective is that we should consider and accept migrants just because they are human beings, and we shouldn't be interested in what they contribute or whether they contribute or not. So this is, I leave it for discussion later on, but I will continue with maybe Amanda. Amanda is here. You're ready, Amanda? I will read Amanda's bio. Amanda is a policy officer in the Migration and Mobility team of the European Center for Developing Policy Management in Maastricht, the Netherlands. She has more than 10 years of policy implementation and research experience in international law, development, migration, and trade. Her research areas are African migration agreements, labor migration, European Union-African migration relations, exploring the linkages between migration agreements and trade in Africa, migration governance, and the interplay between regional and national commitments, as well as private sector involvement in migration management. She has extensive experience in working and liaising with political representatives at the national, regional, and continental levels. She has a background in law and master degrees in international law and economics by the World Trade Institute and international trade policy and trade law at Lund University. In recent years, she has written several articles on free movement policies in Africa, linking the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and labor mobility with the AU Free Movement Protocol. So I will follow with her talk. Please, Amanda.
Thank you, Camelia, and I'm really sorry for coming late. There was a miscommunication with the time. My apologies once again. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this interesting topic of migration governance and human rights, and looking at the perspectives from Africa. So for the World Migration Report, I co-authored a chapter together with PADDY on global governance of migration, and looking at the the evolution of global governance of migration from 2005 until 2022 with the IMRF, which is the International Migration Review Forum, and looking at what the future holds for global governance on migration. I think some of the points, though, to make around global governance of migration would be looking really closely at what migration governance is, right, in general, and what goes into shaping migration governance at the global level. And so if we look really at migration governance, at least the definition that we adopted looked at frameworks of legal norms, regulations, laws, policies, traditions, as well as organizational structures at the subnational, national, regional, and international level, and how these processes shape and regulate state approaches with regards to migration in all its forms, addressing rights and responsibilities, and promoting international cooperation. So this was our working definition of global migration governance. But then if we take this apart and we try to really understand what are some of these legal norms, laws, regulation, policies, traditions, organizational structures, and how have, for example, African countries contributed to shaping global migration governance, I think then we would see that some of these laws and regulations and norms do not fully reflect the position of African countries. Like OTTILIA was saying in her intervention, the position of the AU is to view migration from the perspective of its ability to contribute to development on the continent, and its ability to contribute to positively contribute to enhancing economic livelihoods of people on the continent. That's one of the main points that the AU perspectives that the AU adopts when it's looking at migration. And if we look more closely at the way global migration governance trends are going, the focus on this development aspect and the focus on this link to economic livelihoods is also waning a little bit, and most of the focus is on irregular migration and protecting borders. And so I think from an African perspective, then one of the key questions to ask would be, how can we actually work towards influencing global migration governance, and how can African norms, African legal frameworks, and African regulations also be considered as part of this body that forms global migration governance. Of course, within a certain academics and policy and people who work on policy issues, there is a drive for really including processes from the global south into the discussions and dialogue around global migration governance. And I think that this is something that we could do a bit more of. So I think the first thing that we can look at when we're talking about migration governance is more or less the implementation of these agreed standards that we have in terms of global migration governance. But again, I asked the question, whose standards? But the fact that we have all agreed on this then puts pressure on us to implement, but not implement without without considering our own realities as African countries. And I think it's important, again, that we should be more vocal in these discussions in shaping global migration governance. Another issue I would like to raise here would be the questions around border governance and security. And like I said, the focus has really been now that we see the trend towards really looking at the security of securitization of migration, the trend towards focusing on border governance, and this does not in any way mean that focusing on this is not important. It's just that it is only a piece of the puzzle when you're talking about migration governance. And so the entire focus or the entire discussions should not be around, sorry, I have to wave my hands so the lights stay on. Should not be about border governance and security issues. And if we really look at the issues around border governance, in the context of Africa, most of the borders are artificially drawn, and so there are really livelihoods that exist across these lines. And so this is something that we also need to take into consideration when we're looking at implementing some of these policies and regulations. We need to look at what fits into our own context. How do we adapt these situations, adapt these regulations to our own context, and how to implement without upsetting the reality on the ground. So one of the points that I have argued with some co-authors is to say that the realities of migration on the continent actually go towards shaping what migration governance looks like between countries, so bilaterally, and within regions. So obviously you have these global governance processes that exist, and there are policies there, but the practices on ground, these are some of the things that we should be leaning into in order to find better ways of creating safe spaces for people to move, creating enabling environments for people to move, and ensuring protection of their rights when they're moving. So the next point I would talk about here would be the protection of migrants' rights, and I think that this is something that within the continent, outside of the continent, it's something that we need to keep talking about, because what we are doing now, at least what the trend is showing, is that there are discussions about migrants who are more deserving of the protection of their rights, and migrants who are not as deserving and could have their rights infringed, more or less, if you look at it by implication. And I think it's important to restate that migrants are humans, and humans have rights, and so their rights must be protected. And this is something that we need to keep restating in the discussions around migration, the creation of categories, especially categories of migrants into deserving and not so deserving of a protection of their rights, is something that we should really not be part of as migration governance practitioners. Okay. And lastly, I would also want to look at regional cooperation and policy harmonization. Now, so if we look at the general frame of global migration governance, the issues around regional cooperation and policy harmonization really are how to anchor these global processes either at the national level or at the regional level. So bringing down, for example, things like the Global Compact on Migration, really to the practical steps on how to anchor it at the national level, or with bilateral relations, or regionally, right? Looking at ways to implement, for example, safe corridors, for example, pathways for people to move, also looking at remittances and things like that. I think that's one important way that we can really look at some of these processes. And within the continent, there is the AU level where there are several discussions around migration, and there are several AU policy documents that link to migration. OTTILIA had already mentioned the Free Movement Protocol, looking a step back towards Agenda 2063 that really presents a vision of the Africa that we want. You also find linkages there to migration and the AU's vision for migration as a tool to drive economic development on the continent. Within regions, there are also different frameworks. In West Africa, there's Economic Community of West African States, where you have free movement as part of the integration measures, the regional integration measures. Also in East Africa with the East African Community and the Common Protocol that gives a provision for people to move freely within the region. These are shining examples of the possibilities of working together within regions to create pathways for mobility, and also working towards harmonizing policies around mobility. So in closing, I think looking at global governance of migration and what this means for African countries, I would say that if we look at how the governance of migration has evolved from 2005 with the Global Commission on International Migration until more recently with the IMRF in 2022, and now with the reviews of the Global Compact on Migration, we would see an increased involvement or inclusion of the civil society in these discussions. So going from where it was just really focused on states only discussing issues around migration to now having civil society organizations, non-state actors involved in the discussions around global migration governance processes. And so while this is really a great achievement, there is still more that can be done in including non-state actors, not only as observers or as participants, but also bringing them on board to co-create and co-design some of these policy processes. Because at the end of the day, they are the ones really tasked with understanding how these policies land on the ground, and really in some cases actually implementing some of these policies. A second thing would be to really understand also, when we are discussing in these spaces and we're looking at categories of migrants, understand the implications of creating some of these categories. And really, the reality of migration is that it's a fluid process, right? So moving through these categories sometimes occurs really as a fluid process. Someone might go from being a student to a worker, go through a period of irregularity when their visas or papers are being sorted out, and then go back to being a worker again. And these kinds of things, there are opportunities for people to fall within the cracks because they are not defined by policy categories. And these are things that we really need to bring to the fore in the discussions on migration and creating these migrant categories. And lastly, I think it's important for African countries to continue to shape migration governance, really looking at how norms, especially from the global south, so not only Africa, but how norms practices from the global south can be taken to these global governance processes, can be introduced into these global governance processes. And so the result would then be that the policies that flow from there are already a reflection of our norms, our frameworks, and our practices. And so in order to have a more balanced narrative and a more balanced focus around migration policies. Lastly, talking about migrant rights, I think that within the continent, we actually do a lot of projecting, so looking at how African migrants are treated in other spaces, but we also need to do a bit of introspection to look within the continent and actually see where are the spaces, the safe spaces for people to move within the continent, what's the protection, what protection is available for migrants on the continent, and how possible is it also, even if people want to move for labor, where are the pathways? What exists? How possible is it for people to access some of these pathways? I think these are discussions that we need to keep having in order to really make a better future for migrants, and already looking at the way things are now, how to improve the current condition of migration on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks for showing these realities of what migration governance should look like from the global south. It's very interesting for us because we have the same kind of issues from Latin America. So it's comparison is always good. We learn a lot. And then I will go to our last speaker. It's PADDY SIYANGA KNUDSEN, our colleague from the GRFDT. She really doesn't need to be introduced because most of the people here know her. She's a Zambian national with over 17 years of professional experience as a development economist. Her work covers development cooperation, regional integration, and migration governance. She has worked with IOM, UNESCO, UNHCR, European Union, civil society foundations, and diaspora organizations in continental Europe, Jordan, China, Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, as well as other assignments in West, East, and Southern Africa. Her areas of interest in migration governance include labor migration, migration and development, as well as diaspora engagement. She is also my colleague, vice president at the GRFDT, Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, which is the institution that co-convenes this event. Please, PADDY, go ahead.
Professor Camelia and friends from Latin America, can you hear me?
Yes, you're very audible, yeah.
I think is it buenos dias on your side,
Yes.
Camelia?
Yes.
That is good, and I hope you are loaded you're not as loaded on coffee as some of us in another part of the world. I bring you greetings from Germany. I also bring you greetings from a project that has come out of the GRFDT engaging with civil society, trade unions, as well as diaspora actors. So I bring you greetings from the African Non-State Actors Platform. And I do that deliberately just after Amanda and OTTILIA have shared on the role that Africa continues to want to, the visibility that we want to attach to African actors, both from a state and non-state perspective, in terms of how do we, what does global migration governance mean? But I wanted to also just bring it down to those three actors, thinking about how diaspora, civil society, as well as trade unions, think about these things, because a lot of what I'm going to share today is sort of gives us a little bit of an update. I remember that when Camelia and I had this chat about what do we really bring across for a conversation around global migration governance. And indeed, OTTILIA, Amanda, and myself have written about some of these reflections in the 2024 report, but you will also recall that if you think about how a report is generated, we have had a very latest update. And I'm really glad that, you know, my two sisters from the continent and two have very thankfully brought some of the issues that we see happening, because migrants are not operating in a space sometimes where they're welcome. There's a lot of sort of anti-migrant sentiments that stem out not just from the political perspective, but that you also see quite visibly in the communities, depending on where you are. I was in a conversation on bilateral labor agreements in Germany with countries of origin. And one of the interesting things that you hear more and more, and I'm living in Bonn, in Germany, and for those who are living further in the eastern part of Germany, they will tell you and quite clearly that if you look like me or if you're a person of color, it is a very difficult space in which to live in, even in 2024. But at the same time, you see Germany being very proactively seeking labor outside of Germany, and even going towards Africa. They've gone towards Asia. They've gone towards Latin America, and also not too far here in the Balkans. But you will hear even from people who probably look fairer than me that there are places that are predominantly German. And so you wonder to what extent communities being ready for migrants. And so operating in that space where policymakers could be doing the right things or taking on some good steps. When we hear, for instance, the Global Compact on Migration that we have written extensively about, but also in GRFDT, we have also been very deliberate about socializing civil society actors to understand what the GCM means for them and how they could use it as an advocacy instrument, but by understanding and unpacking it. But at the same time, we've carried out technical debates. So these global compacts are really indeed important. So the refugee one, the migration one, the SDG one as well. So there's also other compacts that are around. While they remain very important, what happens at home is really important as well. So to bring that conversation back. And so when I think about the title that we have in front of us, all our countries have signed up to to universal declarations on human rights. And so it should be a no-brainer, or it should be taken for granted, indeed, that countries will know what to do to make sure that migrants, when they land into their territories, that they're able to afford to them or pass on to them and ensure that their human rights are indeed respected and granted. But this doesn't come automatically. And we've seen over the years that we've had to pile up more and more compacts and agreements, whether they're bilateral labor agreements or the Africa-EU or the EU's intentions for how it seems to want to do migration. We keep on adding on top of them. And this indeed is the ecosystem in which that makes the global migration governance so very, very complicated, because there's people, there is political parties, there is also interests that are coming in there, and there's also various perspectives, as has been discussed. And so when we think about the African continent and the African actors, I think we know for sure that African governments have tried to position themselves in this very complex space, where sometimes there's not even a chair. So the room is open for them to engage, but there is no chair. Or there is one chair for all African countries, all 54 countries, to take that one chair and that one seat and be able to provide diversity across the diversity of perspectives across these different countries. And so there's been a lot of work that has taken part, and as part of the African Non-State Actors Platform, one of the things that we've done is to try and document some of this through some policy briefs that we will share as part of this webinar as well as a resource. Why is this important? Because being in the room has always been important, because that's where, you know, the continent of Africa was deliberated on by people in a room in Berlin not too many years ago. And so being part of rooms creates history. And so it's been very important for African governments to be visible, not just at the UN level, but also in other spaces where migration is being discussed. And so when we talk about key actors, so those would be destinations where we go to. Our countries have really been trying to see how do they make things better. Do we really look at African governments engaging in everything? And yes, they are all over, depending on what the interests would be. But at the same time, what we are trying to understand from the African State Actors Platform is how strategic can African governments be in engaging on migration governance that makes sense for its migrants, and making sense means from a human rights perspective. But we've also seen that there's a shrinking space indeed when we think about a non-state actors. So if it's civil society, it's trade unions, it's diaspora actors in these rooms. And so that is particularly very important. And why? Because we want to remind ourselves that while governments can be very visible, while governments can be very are the ones that are driving legislation, that are providing practical measures in which migration policy is being played out at that national level. Those that surround governments remain very important. And so this whole of society approach remains strategically important in engagement. And that space has become less and less for many different spaces, whether it's people showing up to high-level meetings or indeed just at that national space in terms of co-creation. So these are some of the challenges that African actors continue to confront. But African actors, in terms of civil society and diaspora and trade unions and others, as well as think tanks, have really tried to say, well, how innovative can we be? How do we show ourselves a source of knowledge? And I think OTTILIA and Amanda have alluded to how we are slowly trying to kind of take over the narration of our story. We're also trying to document as much as possible what is Africa's agenda and translating it as best as we can in these different spaces where our member states show up, but also where we think are interesting spaces where our member states should show up but we also leverage indeed on partners in Asia, so civil society partners in Asia, civil society partners in Latin America. A few days ago, we had a conversation with our colleagues from Bloque Latinoamericano. You can Google that. I'm probably not saying it correctly. And you will see that they are working as civil society partners in Latin America, one of the regional networks that advocates for a human rights approach to the GCM, and also talks a lot around the global forum on migration and development. And so that said, on dialogue, one would ask then why is dialogue important in all this? And dialogue is important because when we look, for instance, at the relationship between the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and we look at the Global Compact on Migration as an example, this forum has been very good at trying to articulate a space where we just talk about things. You know, should we talk about the difficult things? Let's talk about regularization. Let's talk about issues around the role of women. We heard OTTILIA share just in terms of cross-border trade, what that means and the impact that it could have on women. Let's talk about climate change and the implications that are there. But let's talk a little bit more also about what we see on innovation. And what about the use of data? And these are some of the ambitions under the current chairship, which happens to be Colombia. So from the side of the world of Latin America, that has formed out. And why should African countries engage in these processes? Because in these processes, it's a way of trying to find not just the networking, but trying to leverage and trying to advocate for global South actors to really push a bit further against what we see as a very challenging a narrative that is growing in our countries of destination. But at the same time, on the African continent, so bringing it back home, despite having this continental perspective, yes, we want to have the free movement protocol, but we also operate in sub-regions. Remember, 54 countries, but we have, you can Google something called Spaghetti Ball. That always interested me working on trade and regional integration. The Spaghetti Ball, and if you say Spaghetti Ball Africa Regional Cooperation, you will get a picture that shows you different countries and how they belong in different regional organizations. And then the African Union was rather thinking, okay, how do we strategize this and leverage on that knowledge? And so they picked these building blocks. And so we also can engage with those building blocks. So the so-called sub-regional mechanisms, and they could be one for covering the East African community, another one that covers countries in the Horn of Africa that looks more at peace and security because that was the emphasis. Another one in Western part of Africa that called ECOWAS, that looks that opened up a little bit and has even advanced a bit more than the others in terms of free movement, but that continues to be impacted by externalization that comes from the European Union. And so that could be a very good entry point for countries organized within the ECOWAS to engage with the European Union and say something is happening about your push to want to push sub-Saharan migrants further down that is impacting on how our migrants move in our region. So sort of infringing onto another border, onto another external market of the EU. And so how do we really think about leveraging on the power that is sitting in these institutions, despite some of the institutional limitations that they may have? We've also been talking a lot at the African non-state actors about the local governments. We're really intrigued in knowing that, when the SDGs, for those who've worked around development, that the SDGs, there was a lot of resistance to talk about the role of decentralization. And there was a pushback because central governments wanted to show up. And this is me reading and listening to many people who worked around the SDG framework and how it came along. Let's see what will happen for the next one. But then you saw a very limited very limited role of local governments. And now we're seeing, with the last decade of action, all of a sudden the localization agenda was picked up. And now we see that push to say we need to put more money at the local, we need more local actors, and we see the emphasis of local actors. And so from the African Non-State Actors Platform, from a migration governance perspective, when we think about global migration governance, we bring it home. The local governments have to have a better emphasis, and they have to have a better role in co-creating the agenda at that global level. Because if they're not showing up in the dialogue space, yes, there is a mechanism under the Global Forum on Migration and Development with a mayor's mechanism, but they're hardly showing up at meetings and they're hardly engaged. One, because they say, what does this have to do with me as a mayor? Because some of them don't know. So there's a role of socialization. And then the other ones just need to understand the importance of their position. And the importance of their position is proximity to migrants. The importance of their position is the proximity to local economic development. And therefore, if we're thinking that local economic development is sitting with local governments, how can migration governance actors not engage local governments only until the last minute because we need to tick boxes in the SDGs? Are we going to wait for this opportunity also for the GCM? So these are the kind of questions we're asking ourselves, but we want to ask clever questions and bring in more and more civil society actors and others who work around these bigger agendas to inform us. We have one more agenda and I will close. The other agenda that keeps us awake is migration has always moved side by side with development in our conversations. But the emphasis that will come from a global North perspective will be to talk about migration from migration and development from we need to do something around the policies, because to be honest, they can take a lot on these policies. They go a little bit faster with legislation. They know how to make nice websites that show you that things are working, that they've done all the papers that need to come out. The practice is a little bit more delayed. They also know how to generate data and be very clever about patching reports that don't make a real meaning for the majority of migrants from a human rights perspective. And therefore, what we need to do is to begin to widen our understanding of this development landscape, because we know that a lot of the migrants are leaving because they don't have the option to stay. When we speak, and you can look up again, the Afrobarometer is another very useful statistical tool. They do a lot of different surveys from different countries, and they try to talk to people. A very interesting methodology that they're using, and they're talking and engaging with people in different African countries. But that they're also engaging, and there are a lot of other organizations that are also just trying to get a grip of understanding why are people moving. And so in understanding this, it also gives us the perception that people move because they do not have an option. Climate is pushing them out. The economics are pushing them out. Conflict is pushing them out. And just the general environment is pushing them out. So how do we make people stay? They cannot make a decent living. Resources are being moved off the coast of West Africa from hibiscus leaves, which they call bisap, to fish that's coming out, that is being fished out, to minerals that come out of Southern Africa and being transported all the way to Europe and many other parts of the world. And to what extent do we see this flight also taking flight of the labor? So to what extent do we begin to talk about the development agenda as migration experts? But also we're talking about the money that is not available for development. There's just not enough money on the African continent because we are locked into a global financial mechanism that has trapped our money in different spaces, illicit financial flows being one of them, and many other arguments around this. So as migration experts and those working with migrants, whether we are diaspora, trade unions, and civil society, we've told ourselves maybe it's time for us to even understand things like the financing for development agenda. Everybody talks about it. Everybody who we know around us is buzzing around it. And some of us are not that engaged because we think, economics, it's not, but we just need to think about what migrants need in terms of pathways. And yes, that is correct. But I also believe, and I'll end here, that our livelihood and the betterment of our continent does not lie in another continent. And I remember flying over, as I end, coming out of West Africa and flying into Europe, coming out of North Africa, flying into Europe and thinking, in God's infinite wisdom, did he think that he would have planted all our hopes and dreams across an ocean where just this week we have heard that there has been a ship that went missing off the coast of West Africa? And just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, an 11-year-old girl, I think she seems to be the only survivor of this particular incident of shipwrecks. And is this the infinite wisdom that's there? And then when we come to humanity, so away from a spiritual point of view, is this the extent of our intelligence in terms of thinking about pathways and options for migrants? And so we want to widen that agenda and again challenge partners of African countries who are also investing in development to move more into the productive, to reduce on what they take out as resources, and for us to really see how we can have job creation, how we can see peace and regional integration really work for the African continent so that their options is not to cross a deadly sea. CAMELIA, I'll stop here and thank you for the time.
Thank you too. We already have some questions in the chat. I will start with the one by Domingos, or unless you want to say it loud, Domingos. And let's start with the questions or comments for OTTILIA, please, because she has to leave in a couple of minutes. So, Domingos, do you want to share your question? Yeah,
yes.
Please.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yes, I am Domingos. Now I'm living in India. I am working here. I am studying also migration and diaspora at GNU. So it was very, very good lectures. But the question I have here, we can see how the international organizations, private sectors, civil society can contribute to influence the governments to work in laws to protect the migrants' rights. Around the world, in Africa also, because in this time, as we know, we have many movements of the people going to Africa, and Africans also going to Asia, America, and we are getting many problems. We are seeing also migrants are getting many problems there because of documentations in the borders, and the rights also are not very clear, because sometimes it seems like the governments are not have the like very, very good conversations about the laws. Like in Africa, we have many organizations in the regions, like in Europe also, but sometimes when Africans people go to outside of the countries, they get a lot of the problems. And I thought that the international organizations, private sectors, and the civil society need to push the government and influence them about this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Domingos. Ottilia, would you like to go ahead and answer?
Thank you very much, Domingos, for that question. So I and I know Paddy and Amanda also work for non-governmental organizations, and as Paddy mentioned, we're also part of the African platform, which includes Africans and African organizations on the continent and also in the diaspora. Now, I say that because a lot of the work that we have been doing is to do exactly what you asked, which is the ways in which you can be able to contribute to influence governments to work on laws. Two things. So the one, I made reference to the push for the protocol on free movement of persons, which for us is a key instrument, not only enabling free movement, but once you do that, you take away some of the avenues of risk that exist. So it's one thing to enact laws that promote and protect human rights, for which all the 55 member states of the AU do have domestic laws that seek to at least advance and protect the rights of migrants. But it's another to be able to ensure that the environment, the space in which migrants occupy, that actually limits the potential for risk. Now, if you have, for example, by way of example, if you have a proper free movement arrangement, the kind of, to use example, threats of violence, sextortion that we see at border posts wouldn't happen, because there wouldn't be a need for individuals to negotiate with border officials their access or exit, because by virtue of them traveling with their valid travel documentation, they are already protected. But in the same vein, a lot of the provisions, and maybe I'll end on this point so that there's more time for questions as well, a lot of these instruments are applied, or they reference that everyone has the rights to. So they don't necessarily have specific provisions for migrants or specific provisions for vulnerable groups within that migrant community. And so it is on that level. So I've spoken about civil society and non-governmental organizations who I believe are doing a great job in this regard. But there is also a responsibility for the private sector as a mechanism to hold to account as well. Unfortunately, in some instances, the private sector has benefited from large numbers of undocumented migrants, in that they've been able to employ undocumented migrants and compensate them less than they would documented migrants and nationals of the countries in which they operate, because they see these migrants and as lacking the protections or access to relief mechanisms, because undocumented migrants are less likely to report that they are being underpaid, because they run the risk then of exposing that they're undocumented, which can mean that they would get deported. So it's almost a catch-22, and I would stress here that it is important that we have the right legal framework that guards against these human rights abuses, at the same time that we also ensure that we hold our governments to account. I'll end by saying that here in South Africa, a number of organizations have taken the government and the private sector to task in court for the treatment of migrants and for the delays in issuing of documentation. So much so that now, at least with our Department of Home Affairs, they have been pushed to reduce the backlog of applications that they had because of a court order. So ideally, we wouldn't have to do this, but it is important to have institutions outside of government that ensure that government is held accountable, and that includes civil society organizations, it includes the judiciary, and it also includes watchdogs for the private sector as well as for government. Thank you, Camelia.
Thank you. In your chapter, you write with Marie O'Cliff, Pablos Rojas Copari, Abasi Shabasi. I will just take one detail that I really liked in terms of positive approaches to what can be done. And you mentioned this example of the free in, free out Dutch firewall protection, where irregular migrants can approach the police to tell about crimes, and the police won't ask if they are irregular or not, right? What is their immigration status? So I was wondering if you can tell us more about what can be innovation in terms of migration policy in such a restrictive context in the global north, you know, in the European Union, and we have the US here in North America. And then this is my question, and I have a question from Professor Sahu from the GRFDT. Do you want to open your microphone, please?
Yes, Professor CAMELIA, I'll speak only audio, no video. Here is some bandwidth problem. So my question is, this narrative is very important because, you know, we have seen there are more powerful narrative to, you know, destabilize the positive narrative of migrants, like the ultra-nationalism in many countries. Those are also targeting the migrants, if you see, because those talk about Bhumiputra or natives or the son of the soil or whatever, and they go against the immigrants. I think it is across Europe and many countries. So how to find a method? So because migrants are marginalized, so how they will influence the powerful through positive narratives? Is it clear?
Yes. Perhaps we can have
my question may be the first speaker, I forgot the name. She was talking about narratives and the entire ecosystem that migration governance involves.
Thank you, Sada. Now we have a question from Iman Ahmed. Yes, please go ahead, Iman.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Camelia. Thank you to the speakers for a very informative session indeed. I have a question for OTTILIA, and I think it's very important what you said about the fact that transit migration creates job opportunities for people beyond the migrants themselves in the local communities. But thinking of how things are being done now between the African continent and the EU, if we argue this, perhaps to the EU, they might say, this is your internal issues. So what messages do you recommend or suggest, in addition to the argument about human rights that Amanda, clearly laid out? Thank you all.
Okay. Also, so if you want, we can start with OTTILIA. If Amanda has time, maybe she can comment a bit also, and then PADDY.
Thanks a lot, Camelia. I know that both Paddy and Amanda probably have responses to these questions as well, so wouldn't want to hog, so I'll be quite brief. I'll start with Iman's question, and Iman, thank you very much. Incidentally, Iman is also part of the same platform that we're on, and really, I say this beforehand because the work that she's been doing, particularly around the context in Sudan, is really commendable. And so while not one of the speakers, I always think it's important for us to recognize the range of people within our community and the work that people are doing both on the continent and in the diaspora. So thank you so much, Iman, for the work that you're doing. I'll start with your question around transit and the counter that it would be that these are your internal issues. If anything, over the past decade, more over the past 5 years, has taught us anything, is if you regard the issues happening elsewhere only as internal issues, they will unfortunately soon knock on your door, if I can put it quite bluntly. Whether it is a conflict context within the African continent or what we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine, and now also within the Middle East with the occupied Palestinian territories, with Syria, with Yemen. It is to say, one can respond and say, well, we don't have to deal with those issues. But we see that right now, the EU's externalization policy has extended almost the EU's borders into the African continent. And so that makes it very much their external policy issue as much as it is an internal issue for the African continent. Now, why are these things connected? If people who had their livelihoods and who were able to sustain themselves before are unable to do so because of an externalization policy, we have seen in some countries, I cite the Gambia, Cote d'Ivoire, as well as Niger and Mali, we have seen an increase of people leaving those contexts to seek better opportunities elsewhere. And some of these have been transit countries, not always countries of departure. And so what might appear an internal continental issue, as I said, can become an external issue if it is not dealt with properly and with the care that it deserves. Which brings me to the question that was asked around counter narratives. And I'm going to be brief on this because I know that Paddy has done a lot more work on this particular issue. But what we have found with our ISS research is you can use data as a way to counter the narratives, but unfortunately, data on its own does not achieve that goal. Because migrants, so for example, you have migrants are committing crime in our communities. If you say, for example, actually proportionally, migrants are committing less crime in some of these communities, it doesn't always mean that the person hearing the news will take it to mean, well, okay, migrants are not committing crime in their communities, because all they need is one or two people anecdotally that they use as examples. It is for this reason that counter narratives shouldn't focus, and maybe let me rephrase, it's for this reason that narratives shouldn't be framed as counter narratives, but rather narratives that focus on the positive aspects more. So you don't say, I am responding to your negative perception by giving you a positive. You simply focus on the positive messaging, because then it's not perceived as defensive in that way, because unfortunately counter has those negative connotations. The final one is the first question that was asked around, Camelia, that you asked around reporting. The simple solution would be a harmonization of approaches across jurisdictions. Unfortunately, what we are seeing is an increase in fragmentation. So we're seeing some countries not requiring the documentation of those reporting crime, and then others insisting on it. Now, what that does, the ones that insist on the documentation, is it creates a culture of fear and reinforces some of the negative stereotypes. So one of the key recommendations that we make is to draw on the positive experiences where this is not pushed, and how that has actually been able to address some of the key challenges in communities. We have seen that in countries in Europe, but we're also seeing it on the African continent, here in South Africa, where you do not put a requirement for identification to report crime, that people are more willing to come forward and do so. And so the lesson for us here is draw on the positive examples from other jurisdictions, and ideally we would have more countries adopting such approaches and not less. Unfortunately, there is a fragmentation. Even, and I'll end with this, in the United States, for example, different states have different measures. So some states do not require you to provide your documentation when you're reporting, while other states will in fact use this as a basis on which they report you to ICE. So where there is consistency, that can also assist. Thank you, CAMELIA.
Thank you, OTTILIA. PADDY, do you want to add on these 3 questions? Maybe PADDY is not.
Did you want to come in?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, OTTILIA. I was going to give the chance to Amanda to just share, and I'm just thinking here, maybe just as an addition. I think, yes, you know, OTTILIA has spelled it out really well in terms of, you know, what are those entry points, and we need to, in terms of engaging with actors that, you know, the actors that be around global migration governance, and I think this collaboration becomes essentially more and more important. But then I wanted to just draw in on the narratives and the data, and it's true that, I mean, we've seen more and more governments kind of go into setting up policies, legislation around, for instance, you know, eliminating discrimination, and then also kind of reporting mechanisms that come across. And then there's also a need, there's also been a, you know, an emphasis on kind of showing different types of data. And of course, we are not still at this position where we can say we have good data, but we also know that sometimes good data is not all we need for us to see any meaningful change in terms of having more human rights approaches for migrants. And so I think what remains still important is an impact on the people. And I think some of what OTTILIA has said is, from the research that they have done as ISS, is really important. How do you sort of go back to the framing of messages, right? How do we understand how messages impact on those whom we would like to move? Because if we've got a population that understands who migrants are and understand their value, and as you go along the line, you see those who are probably not really understanding, but are kind of receptive and, let's say, much more open. And so it's about how do you move those in the middle? And then it may be difficult to reach the extreme, but to understand what that means. Here in Germany, speaking to people who work around racial discrimination and the elimination of these from a diaspora perspective, there is one party that seems to have invested quite a lot in terms of the use of the anti-migrant sentiment. I mean, they invested really heavily on social media and in other spaces so that there's a certain type of messaging that has actually played on what has been used as a way of balancing the narrative on migration. And so you think about those levels of investment, and I'm not saying we need to invest heavily in that way, but I think we need to invest in a different type of knowledge, trying to impact how knowledge will impact behavior. And I think these are the small changes that are happening in the education system. You see that, but sometimes it's really moments within communities, and it's allowing more migrant stories coming from migrants, diaspora, and I think this will make the switch. But unfortunately, you know, artificial intelligence, as I learned from somebody who coined that expression, I didn't. is that is much more difficult than the use of artificial intelligence. How we work with empathy and things like this, we have seen it. We've seen double standards also within Europe, if you like, if you're talking about the treatment of African migrants. Within Europe, a case and example is, migrants that were fleeing Ukraine, and you could see quite visibly and quite clearly the conditions that were provided to Ukrainians, and those who were of any other origin. And we have a lot of African migrants that were calling Ukraine home, whether it was 2 months or they had been there for several years, not having the same access to protection measures here within Europe. And each of the countries taking a different stance. 3 of these countries basically just closed the door unless it was really Ukrainian. So third country nationals had very limited, third country nationals who would also, in that group, you've got Africans, would have been closed out of that door. So I'll end there with a comment and allow the floor for OTTILIA. For Amanda to come back, and if there's more questions.
I think Amanda is not here at the moment. Maybe she will return. She had to leave, but I will take one question from the chat and make a comment myself. Thanks, Iman, Iman is also a member of the GRFDT, our colleague, for your comments. Yeah, thanks. And the question here from Maria Blandon is, Salinas is, how can we manage this perspective of migrants and refugees being considered as a security risk for the countries of destination? And I think you already talked a little bit about it. And my comment is on what OTTILIA said, that data doesn't matter. Of course, it matters in a way. It matters for us who do research on migration, but for common people who are worried about migration, we've seen that emotions matter more, and the research that we've done in communication on migration says that people who are worried about migrants don't want to hear as much as we would like about multiculturalism, but about what migrants have in common with it, right? So we like when we eat out, we like to eat exotic food, but we don't want our exotic neighbor next to us. So these kind of people who reject immigration, they want to hear about, of course, the positive aspects, about the emotions, and about the people, what they have similar to them, so that they stop fearing immigration, right? And then we have a comment here from, it's not me. Next to me, there is a hand raised. Can you please say who you are? And
Hi, Camelia, this is me, Raj.
Professor Raj Barduli from, okay.
I'm sorry, I signed from your link. My apologies. I had put in a couple of points in the chat, which are not necessarily a question, but perhaps a question will arise, time permitting. And my apologies, I was in and out because I was in the dentist chair. But I have listened to most of it. And thank you very much to the presenters for very lucid presentation. Here we're talking about very important human rights instead of migrants, and we cannot emphasize more. The point I'm making here is that the narratives that are negative or not true narratives on migration and against migrants. How does one tackle that? It's a very loaded thing, and you can't change people's attitudes. Even though there's data, people are not interested in, especially in the North. They're not interested in knowing that the migrants contribute to their development, or they are needed everywhere. They know that. What they don't want is, they don't want this cultural mix. There's this social cultural concerns. Now, when those are the concerns, because those are very, in a way, not understood, that people move because it's a natural thing to move. It is very natural to move. People have moved all along. And especially now with globalization and other dynamics unfolding, there will be movement. There is the demographic shift, there's the technology, there's the need for labor, so on and so forth. So how do policymakers have an important role to play in understanding and making their constituents understand that this is not a threat as long as there is regular migration. And of course, they have very limited regular pathways. And that is why people are resorting to irregular migration. And in fact, the countries in the north are creating problems for themselves because they are issuing work permits to those who have skills, not realizing that not every person needed in their country has to have certain skills, because everybody's skilled in one way or the other, whether you clean the road or whether you prepare computer programs and so on. So what I'm trying to say here is that two things. One, that the changing dynamics need to be understood by policymakers and then narrated and discussed with their constituents. And secondly, this is here to stay. People have moved all along. So this has to be understood rather than played upon. Politicians are, in order to get votes, they're playing upon and focusing on wrong narratives or negative narratives. So who was saying that the grassroots or NGOs are doing a great job in terms of educating, but who are they educating? So they have to reach the policymakers, and whether they can reach the policymakers is another thing. Otherwise, if we write reports and we talk to ourselves, it doesn't help. So what am I saying? What am I saying is that a lot of work needs to be done, and it has to be done at whatever level we can do, and to see that the message gets there, that people are not a threat. Open up the regular pathways, and there will be no reason for them to then come irregularly, okay? Because you have closed. You only have limited pathways, and there's a lot of demand, both in the receiving countries, and there is demand for labor, for work outside. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Raj. Yes, if you would like to answer, OTTILIA and PADDY.
Thank you very much, CAMELIA and Professor Raj. I will say, in your question, you really provided some of the answers, and I think that is why, at least in my view, these conversations are so critical. I did put in the chat, for example, why community or a global community of people who are really supporting more positive narratives matters. And I say this because often, as an African and an African living on the continent, I will state some of these things, and people may agree. But at the back of their mind still is, of course, she would think this, because I am speaking about Africa, and I'm speaking about Africans, which is where I'm from, and the people in my community. But I've seen what value global forums, such as the one many of the people that are on this call are part of, but also where regional clusters are also are involved, what immense value those kinds of partnerships play in passing on this message from a global point of view. So yes, these are what we have discussed this evening, morning, or afternoon, depending on where you are very much also African issues. But I would also say we could have this very same conversation around the migration conversations and issues in the Americas and in Asia as well, and in Europe, because we are seeing this play out globally. So what can we do to be able to lend support to other communities in ways that are equally constructive, based on our experiences, and why I really valued this convening, because it is a convening that has brought people working on African issues, but to be able to have this exchange at a global level as well. So I cannot re-emphasize enough the points that you have made, Professor Raj, Prof. Camelia. You also made these points, and PADDY, that indeed data for us is extremely useful. It is a useful tool. And I work for the Institute for Security Studies, so I will never say that there's no space for data. But I will say, and I'll use one example, then I'll end, that one of the things that we have been doing at South Africa level is we have supported a process led by South African government. The Statistics Office and the Department of Social Development initiated a process under our population policy approach known as the Migration and Urbanization Forum, for which a number of organizations, the ISS included, IOM included, are part. And this process for us was important because it was a government-led initiative where different parts of government were not agreeing on the data. So the Statistics Office was saying that the numbers that they are seeing from the Department of Home Affairs around irregular migrants does not correspond with the census data. And the Department of Social Development was saying, if we do not have the right information, we are not able to provide social assistance to the population that we need to be accessing. And for them, it's because they offer social assistance to all in need, but in particular, children are not required, rather, to provide any proof of status in order to get access to social assistance in South Africa. So they were saying, if the numbers say there's only 200,000 children that need support, when in fact it is 1 million, that they are unable to effectively do their job. So they convened a Migration and Urbanization Forum. We meet regularly. We, in fact, observed International Migrants Day yesterday because in South Africa next week, everything will be closed. So we observed it a few days early, but this was an initiative of the South African government in which actors from the Justice Security Cluster, the Statistics Office, as well as social development were part. And the reason why I use this example is because these are some of the departments 5 years ago were quite instrumental also in some of the negative narratives. This is not to say that our job is done, because if you just Google South African narratives on migration, you'll see that unfortunately we still have a xeno-antagonism problem. And the responsibility is on civil society organizations, but importantly also it is on government to be able to ensure that the right information reaches the community to counter some of these negative narratives. If we don't work together, we simply will not be able to achieve the goals that we've set out for ourselves. Thank you, Camelia.
Thank you. We are approaching the end of the event. Paddy, do you want to also comment on these questions? Yes?
Yes, you know, I'm I'm looking at the questions and comments. Sorry, I'm just in a taxi, and I'm thinking about what OTTILIA has also shared, and I'm thinking a little bit more about, you know, to what extent. Sorry.
We cannot hear you anymore. Yeah. I think we lost Paddy, but I wanted to point at a comment by Domingos again about this shared responsibility. He was saying, I think action should be taken for Africans when they migrate to protect their rights This is very true. And then Iman also added, I'm honestly concerned about the over-liberalization of South-North migration. It is neo-slavery, very reductionist and dehumanizing. True. So maybe we will get Paddy again, but in the meantime...
Camelia, am I back? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I tried to turn on my video and it was not very successful.
Okay.
I was just going to maybe come back and thanks for the comments that you have shared and also for OTTILIA. I think what kind of sits in front of us now is for us to see with everything that is happening around the world and how migration is really an important is an issue that cannot even leave the lips of politicians. How do we make sure that what comes out is more around the benefits that migrants bring? Because if we're looking at it even from an African, intra-Africa perspective, we can clearly see that people need to move. And whether we're talking about mobility in terms of visa facilitation, or we're talking about migration so that people can actually establish some kind of a residence, temporal or permanent as it may be, that we have these options available so that we begin to cut off the market that has been opened for traffickers. And that also means that there will be the emphasis around saving lives will not happen just because we feel very bad about bad news that comes in, and it's all about dealing with the root causes. So that's where we are, and I think these are the kind of challenges that we have, and they need a collaborative action. It cannot just be about data. It can't just be about empathy. It can't even be about the beauty that migration brings and benefits that we see in multicultural cities across all over the world. But that we need to have more global.
Okay, I think we lost Paddy again, but we got to hear maybe the most important things. I would like to congratulate the speakers and of course thank everyone who joined us today. There is a link in the chat for the certificate of participation in case you need it. The speakers will get it as a courtesy by CISAN. And I would like to remind everyone that this event was co-organized by the National Autonomous University of Mexico through the Center for Research on North America, which is better known as CISAN, and also the GRFDT, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism. We invite you to follow us on future events, webinars, as well as in person. We have a big Congress of North American Studies next year in February. We organize a lot of events, so please stay tuned on our social networks, and let this be a beginning. Please come back. OTTILIA, Amanda, she's not here, but I still invite her. And of course, Paddy, to CISAN, and maybe we can have you in person one day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Camelia.
Camelia.
Thank you.
Thank you
I
so
will
much.
look forward to empanadas.
Oh, yes, please. Yes, and thanks for being here. I know you have to leave, but and to be in another meeting in 7 minutes, which is quite tough.
Yeah.